Hey Gear Seekers, I'm Nick. It's been a little while since we checked out our Beelink Mini PC. Actually, since the SER4. I've got the brand new Beelink SER8. This is an absolutely beastie little unit. I've been tinkering with this one for a few weeks now, just before we left for Computex. And what makes this special is it features the brand new Ryzen 7 8845HS. It's an 8-core CPU with integrated graphics that pulverizes the rest of these integrated graphics APUs out there on the market. Let's take a bit of a look at this thing because I think you guys are going to find this one pretty interesting. Still a mini PC thing.
This video is brought to you by VIPSCDkey.com. Have you ever installed Windows 11 only to see the watermark of death? You don't need to fork out a couple of $100 for a key. You can grab one from today's video sponsor, from VIPSCDkey.com for 1/10 of the price. You can use our code GEAR to get 30% off for this month only. How good is that? That takes that already cheap Windows 11 key and makes it even cheaper. It's easy as placing your order. Bingo bango! You've got your new key on your orders page. You chuck that key into the activation screen and you're good to go. No more watermark of death. Use code GEAR to get 30% off for this month only. Link in the description. On with the video. Back to you, Nick.
Here's the thing with mini PC content on the channel. I always want to do lots of these. The trickiest thing has always been trying to get our hands on these mini PCs. That's why it's been such a long time since we've covered a Beelink mini PC, because they're typically harder to get here for one main reason. They don't usually ship with Australian power adapters. We've got a different plug to every other country, but it doesn't matter. We've got adapters and other plugs that we can make this work. So it's not a big problem whatsoever. As well as that, when Beelink reached out and said, hey, we've got the SER8 and these are the specs, I absolutely jumped on the chance because we checked out the SER4 back in 2022 and I absolutely love that mini PC. In fact, I'm still using it to this day. I'm gonna stop yapping. Let's pop it open. I'm going to show you what makes the SER8 tick. That's kind of hard to say, SER8. Yeah, too much coffee today. There's little rubber grommets around the edge that have screws underneath them. For this, I recommend something kind of sharp because it's rubber. I usually just stab these things just to pull them out. So we'll just stab it with my little tweezers, I would call them. I use these for picking off surface mount stuff when I'm soldering because they're sharp and whatnot. Anyway, we need to remove the 4 screws first. And I will pull this off with the rubber tab. And now we have this other piece of metal in here which says dust regularly, or rather it's asking nicely, please dust regularly. This is a dust filter. For mini PCs like this, these are much higher performance ones. It's good that they have a dust filter included. To remove that, it's 2 screws. And it takes a little bit of fendangling to get it off because I've got chubby chorizo fingers, so sometimes it's difficult for me to get into places I need to get into, and we can just lift that out. We have access to the inside of the SER8. There's some massive heat sinks here for the M.2 setup in here. We'll just remove that as well, just so we can get a bit of a look so you guys can see what's going on here, because the SER8 supports 2 2280 M.2 drives. It is unusual to see mini PCs support that many drives, but because of the size of this mini PC, it makes a lot more sense than you would imagine. This one also has 32 gigs of DDR5 memory. This is SODIMM laptop memory. It will take up to 96 gigs in total. And as we pop that off, you can now see there is another 2280 slot, as well as there being the Wi-Fi card as well. Now, we can go one step further and remove all of the innards, but we're not going to do that. Essentially, what's underneath this is a big cooling fan, and I think it's about 110 mils from memory, and yeah, the thermal performance of this for a mini PC is quite good. And that's really the reason why the SER8 is so big, is to accommodate the extra headroom for the thermal performance. I think the internal design of the SER8 is a bit better than we've seen with many other mini PCs. The motherboard itself is a lot bigger than you would typically see on a mini PC. And like I said, 2 2280 M.2 slots is awesome, because if you really wanted to, You could set this up as a NAS and you could boot it off a USB device or any other type of device if you really wanted. The CPU is on the other side of the motherboard, but as I mentioned, there's a lot more screws to pull that off, so we're not going to be doing that in this video. If it is something you want to see, I'm sure someone else has completely torn this apart, but I did want to show you just how we get in and take a look at the storage situation inside the SER8. For rear I/O, we've got two USB type A ports. These are USB 3.2 ports. We've got 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, which is standard at this point. We've got display port, which is nice to see, HDMI. We've also got another USB type A port. We've got a headphone jack and the most interesting port of all. Now, this appears to be a regular USB-C port. This is USB 4, which means we get 40 gigabit throughput and PCIe tunneling, which means this is technically Thunderbolt 4 as well. And we've got a 19 volt 5.26 amp power input as well. On the front side, we've got a power button, which is a combined power light, a little reset button. There's another headphone jack, another USB Type-C port, and a USB Type-A port. So as far as mini PCs go for connectivity, this is pretty standard. That standout port on the rear is definitely the USB 4.0 port. All right, here we are in the BIOS of the SER8. Let's take a bit of a look and show you guys what's going on here. First of all, you can see that we've got the Ryzen 7 8845HS. This is an 8-core CPU. We've got the Radeon 780M for internal graphics, which is very, very spicy. And we'll just go through a couple of the settings here just so you guys can get a bit of an understanding of what's going on here. For the idle temperature for CPU, it's actually quite low, which is no surprise because the cooling for this SER8 is kind of overkill for a mini PC. You have to remember, these are mobile chips that have been repurposed to go in a desktop. So, you know, it is what it is. We also have things like being able to control resizable bar. I'm going to turn that on. We've also got SRIOV support for virtualization as well, and a bunch of other things that you would typically find on mini PCs. For the networking configuration stuff here, you can enable PXE boot, which is nice, just in case you wanted to net boot this for some reason. As well as that, we've got the regular stuff here, all the NVMe drive configuration stuff. We've got a 1 terabyte drive here. You'll also see we've got 32 gigs of RAM, DDR5 memory, at 5600 megatransfers. All the spicy stuff is in the AMD CBS configuration menu. For the graphics configuration, we can change the frame buffer here. 4 gig is standard. You can push it up to 16 gig, but for a mini PC like this, I think 4 gig is more than adequate. We can change the TJ Max for the CPU as well because of the way that this is set up. So we have automatic thermal control, but because this is in this desktop configuration and not a laptop configuration, you might want to push it a little bit harder than you would usually push, especially for an APU. Laptops don't usually have this much thermal headroom, but you can actually push this APU up to 54 watts in the BIOS as well, which is nice to see. There's a whole bunch of other options here that you may or may not find interesting, but again, you can change all of this stuff. So you can do quite a bit of tweaking to push this as far as possible. What's good to see is manual fan control. You can force PWM fan control and you can then set up different ranges for different temperature ranges. So let's say, for instance, low temperature range, you can set the percentage of the fan and low PWM fan ratings as well. There is another PWM fan header on the board of this as well, but doesn't use the standard PWM fan header. It uses one that you typically find in these small and mini PCs. So yeah, let's boot into Windows and we'll take a bit of a look at what you get on the standard Windows installation here. The Beelink logo is so strange, but Claire pointed out it looks like the butt of a bee, which I never really got. I thought it just looked like a spinning top. I've already set this up. I've used this for a couple of videos already, which I haven't mentioned, but yes, we have everything set up and ready to go. We'll just pop open Task Manager so you guys can see what the story is with the hardware configuration. So we've got, as mentioned, the 8845HS which is an 8-core 16-thread CPU. As well as that, we've got that 32 gigs of memory. It is running at the full 5600 megatransfers. We've got a 1 terabyte SSD and that Radeon 780M graphics. Now, I know what you want to know. What is that performance like with this APU? Let's find out. First of all, we've got XDefiant at 720p medium. What you're seeing right here is the performance for this APU is really, really good. And this is kind of the trend going forward with all of the testing we did here. There are some outliers, as you're about to see. Like, we're averaging about 45 frames per second with XDefiant at 720p medium. But if we switch on over to 720p high, we're only seeing that drop a little bit to around about, I'm going to say 118 frames or around about 120, and with dips as low as about 95 frames per second. So even still, the performance is quite impressive. Now, I wanted to bump this up to ultra settings. This isn't a realistic setting you would use for something like XDefiant, but I was curious to see what that would be like. And we're seeing average performance sit around about 70 frames per second with dips into around 65 frames per second. So still quite impressive. But let's up the resolution here a little bit. Let's do XDefiant at 1080p medium. And we're seeing quite impressive frame rates here as well. We're seeing as high as around 112 frames per second with dips to around about just over 100 frames per second. So quite good at 1080p medium. Almost hard to believe this is an APU. Next up is 1080p high. This one is a little bit unrealistic for XDefiant. It's not the most optimized title ever, but still we're seeing about 80 frames per second at 1080p high. And just for something a little bit different and something completely unrealistic, I wanted to do 1080p ultra just to see what that would look like. And the performance you're seeing here is quite average, like 40 to around 45 frames per second, with averages sitting around about 42 FPS with dips to about 38 frames per second. So, overall, not terrible. But I wanted to show you what real gameplay would look like if you're playing XDefiant. So here, this is 1080p high. As I said, this is not really a realistic setting for this APU in this game, but we're seeing about 60 frames per second, which is quite good. What you will notice is I'm really, really bad at XDefiant, so don't judge me. Also, I'm playing on a terrible mouse and keyboard combo here, like one of those cheap $10 Microsoft ones that I just can't aim with very well. So I get absolutely slapped in this gameplay. But to be honest, I'm quite surprised with the performance here. As you're seeing, as we go into areas where there's less players, we get frame rates up to around 75 frames per second. But when you're sitting around in action, it's hovering around 55 to 60 frames per second, which at 1080p high on an APU, if you were to tell me that this could happen on a mini PC just a year or two ago, I wouldn't believe you. This performance is outstanding. But onto a title that I actually play, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. We're running some of the benchmarks here just to give you a bit of an idea of what's going on here. This is the 1080p recommended setting here. Now, this benchmark always performs quite well. Doesn't really matter about what hardware you're using. As well as that, I decided to not use FSR for this test, just so you guys can get a bit of an idea of what it would look like if you weren't using FSR. We have a resolution scale, I think from memory, around 59%, which is basically just the recommended setting here. And as you're seeing, the performance here is quite good. We're not getting heaps of frame rate dips at all, and it's quite consistent. It's not bad at all. If we take a quick look at the results screen here, this will show you a little bit about what I was talking about. You can see here, 125 average. Now onto 1440p recommended, which is actually kind of crazy for an APU. Same test, same settings, recommended setting, just to give you guys a bit of an idea of what the performance looks like here. And I gotta say, at 1440p for the benchmark, it's pretty impressive here. I think the resolution scaling is around about 50 odd percent. We'll see in the final screen when the benchmark completes, so you can get a bit of an idea of what the exact setting was. But again, this is 1440p. this is really good performance. Obviously, you're losing some visual fidelity. 89 frames per second isn't too bad, and a 58% resolution render scale. Now, I ran this the next day. I wanted to show you guys what 1080p recommended with FSR3 in performance mode was like. This is at 100% render resolution scaling. Now, FSR does its own thing. What this does is it gives us better image quality. So this is with image quality comparable to if you were running 1080p natively on this with no type of render scaling at all. This looks fairly decent. And as you're about to see here, the results are going to speak for themselves. We're looking at an average of 100 frames per second and 50% render resolution, but we are upscaling so it looks like 1080p. Now, 1440p with the same settings here, this looks really, really good when you're looking at it with your eyes. I don't know how well it translates to me using the capture card to record this so you guys get an idea, but this looks really good for an APU. This is better than GPUs from maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah, this is incredible that a integrated GPU can perform this well. And as you're seeing here, the results around about 68 FPS with a 50% resolution render scale. Yeah, not too bad at all with FSR. Now, here's some gameplay. I thought you guys might find this one a bit more interesting. 90% resolution scaling at 1080p, and like the performance is, it's not bad. It does feel like there's a little bit of input delay. You got to remember as well, I'm using that really crappy Microsoft keyboard and mouse combo thing with the USB dongle. It's completely terrible. My aim is rubbish here, but this is just to give you guys an idea. The performance isn't too bad at all. I wanted to try something realistic that I would probably use. 1440p, recommended settings, FSR 3.0 in performance mode with that 50% render scale. It looks really, really good. And the performance here is really, really good. Getting about 95 to 100 frames per second on average. This is crazy for an APU. I cannot believe an APU performs like this. This is actually like desktop class graphics. This is so, I can't believe it. It's insane. And I think the SER8 is very impressive. Now onto Cyberpunk. I did this one with the ray tracing low preset just because I wanted to see what ray tracing performance was like. You're not going to break any records with this benchmark at all. It's pretty average if I'm being honest. Look, we're getting about 24 frames per second, pretty cinematic. And when we get to the results screen, you can see all of the telemetry, an average of 26 frames per second. And it's, yeah, you're not breaking any records with this, but I decided to use the Steam Deck preset. This is an interesting one for APUs and typically performs a lot better. Again, we're using FSR here as well as at 1080p, which is higher than the Steam Deck's native resolution. But this will give you a good idea of what the performance would be like. And, you know, again, we're not breaking any records here, but for Cyberpunk, it's more than playable. It is a single player game. So, you know, 47.45 FPS. Definitely not terrible results here for Cyberpunk, but not the best. Here is one of the most interesting tests that we did with this whole thing, and that is the thermal results. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the thermals for the SER8 are absolutely fantastic. I've almost never seen a mini PC perform like this thermally, and the greatest thing about this is I'm not even going to talk about acoustics, because if you listen right now to the SER8, I'm currently running the same thermal testing that I did. I'm absolutely smashing this thing right now, and listen, it's dead quiet. That is unbelievable for a mini PC. This is hands down the coolest and quietest mini PC that I've ever seen. So good work, Beelink. That's why they made this thing slightly bigger than other mini PCs, because it just makes the thermals better. And the other thing is, it's really not that much bigger than other mini PCs. Here's a little bit of a side-by-side with the Geekom A8. I haven't got around to testing this yet. It is quite similar in spec, but look at the size difference between these mini PCs. Pretty crazy, right? So make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on and all that stuff that YouTubers tell you to do, because we're going to take a look at the Geekom A8 very, very soon. The reason why we didn't have it included in this video was basically because I just didn't have enough time to test it as well. So yeah, that one arrived a bit later and this one arrived before Computex. Anyways, what do I think of this thing? Well, it's an interesting mini PC for a few reasons. First of all, the price isn't terrible. I think I showed it at the start of the video. You're looking at around 649 US dollars at the time of filming the video. That's around about 1100 Aussie dollars. You're getting a 1TB drive, 32 gigs of RAM, and this pretty impressive little 8845 HS. Now, I already know what people are going to say. There's no difference between this one and the Ryzen 7000 equivalent. Well, you're technically right. But the thing is, there's no SER8 with this configuration, so that argument doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. What does make sense is just how potent the little iGPU is. I was very, very surprised by all of the testing that we did with this thing. I had no idea that the 780M was as powerful as it is. It's incredible that a mini PC can now perform better than a lot of desktop class GPUs from just 3 or 4 years ago. And it's the size of a CD case or smaller. This thing is actually smaller than a CD case. This is smaller than the Mac Mini. This is an incredible piece of hardware and I really, really like it. And I think you guys are gonna like it too. Now, I've got some other plans with this. I'm going to be doing a whole video where we're gonna get our whole collection of mini PCs that we've got, especially all the new ones. We're going to put Linux on all of them. And we're going to do a whole stack of Linux testing. So make sure you subscribe if that's something you want to see. There it is, ladies and gents, the Beelink SER8, an absolute freaking powerhouse of a mini PC. And I don't hate it. I was very surprised with how much I like this thing. I would go as far as saying that you can just use this as a mini gaming PC and you're not going to hate your experience. Yeah. That's it, I think. I'm your boy Nick with Gear Seekers. You peek, we seek, and yeah, we'll catch you next time with some more mini PC stuff. Well, probably not next time, but you know, make sure you stick around because we have heaps more to cover. Thanks for watching.